to our session on reproduction and the environment. Our first speaker is Luana Adriano Arujo, who will be speaking to us about reproductive violence of Brazilian women with disabilities. So without further ado, Luana, take it away.
Okay, can you enable the share screen for me? Is it possible?
Yeah, I can do that. One moment. It should work now.
Okay, just because I have an accent, as you may realize, so probably it would be better for us to follow my presentation with the slides. So, so the name of my presentation, as stated, is Reproductive Violence of Brazilian Women with Disabilities. So firstly, I would like to tackle the very meaning of reproductive violence as a broader umbrella concept in which we can identify different types of violence actions. I would mainly identify three ways to approach the issue of reproductive violence, which are its definition as an infringement of autonomy, as a type of sexual violence, and as a kind of harm. Literature reproductive violence will also be often connected to sexual violence, but it's different from that because, as stated by Gray, reproductive violence constitutes a violation of reproductive autonomy or is directed at people because of their reproductive capacity. I highlighted these expressions here, namely autonomy and capacity, because as we will see, those are the terms in the literature of reproductive bioethics that entangles with concepts from principles in bioethics, such as autonomy, paternalism, and consent. And secondly, another conceptual possibility we have is the one which poses reproductive violence as one form of sexual violence. And this has actually been the sense of the annual reports of the UN Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence, while it stated in 2019 that the term conflict-related sexual violence refers to rape, sexual slavery, forced prostitution, forced pregnancy, forced abortion, enforced sterilization, marriage, and any other form of sexual violence against women, men, girls, or boys that is directly or indirectly linked to conflicts. On the legal side of the discussion, this has been a standard interpretation, especially in criminal law. The Constitution explicitly states that rape, sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, pregnancy, enforced sterilization, or any other form of sexual violences are crimes against humanity and war crimes. This portrayal, I would say, is rather problematic for two reasons. First, there are reproductive violence acts, such as sterilization, which are better off disentangled from sexual violence, especially when we consider people with disabilities who suffer harms in their rights of reproduction due to spread myths about sexuality and disability. At last, another definition tries to portray reproductive violence as an action that causes harm. This type of definition is mainly related to remedies or reparative programs that seek to repair the damage done to someone who has been a victim of reproductive violence. The main problem with this kind of definition is the intricacies of trying to measure the unmeasurable. Here we have to always remember that the focus on harm should not be an attempt to measure it for the sake of proportional compensation.
Excuse me, Luana. The sound quality is actually coming in and out a bit, and we were wondering if it might be better if you turned your video off for the sound quality to be better. Thank you.
Just a moment. Let me see how I do this. Stop video. Do you think it's better now?
I think so, but you should go on just to make sure.
Here, regarding the conception of sexual reproductive violence as harm, we have to remember that the focus on harm should not be an attempt to measure it for the sake of proportional compensation. The focus on harm here should then be on situational acknowledgement of harms experienced by victims, and also an adequate correlation between the harms experienced and the foreseen remedies. So now I would like to move on to describe, as I promised in my title presentation, the scenario in Brazil from two perspectives, those being first the sociological studies that analyze specific cases of sterilization, and secondly, the legal scenario that sustains judicial authorizations of sterilizations. So firstly, I would highlight one study by Regis in 2013, who studied parental discourses surrounding the seek for involuntary sterilization of 23 women with intellectual disability. In this study, Regis got to the conclusion that the main justification, one of the main justifications, was stopping menstruation, which had to do with the decrease of the amount of care and attention to hygiene that menstruation of the one cared for requires. Other two justifications, and these are the ones, the slides, which I think are very interesting to our discussions, were preventing pregnancy and protection from sexual violence. And now for the first justification, which is prevention of pregnancies, Regis concluded that here sterilization is used as a contraceptive method, and this was mentioned by parents and caregivers as the most convenient alternative, precisely because it's a definitive measure, precisely because of the definitive nature of this measure. So these parents also expressed the conviction that a pregnancy of daughters with disabilities would be something deemed unacceptable, and as it seemed, there is a relationship of domination of these parents, the body of their daughters, the bodies of their daughters. Justified precisely.
Luana, you're cutting in and out a lot. It's extremely difficult to hear what you're saying. I wonder.
Okay, so probably I can connect with my cell phone.
Okay.
So now I will enter again the conference room, and then you let me know if things are better.
Okay.
Recording in progress.
So now I just have to mute myself. So now it's so now probably you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so let's do it like this, and then afterwards I'll come back to the computer. Internet, right? So this is some wonders of the internet world. So as I was saying, this study carried out by Regis concluded that the utilization of sterilization as a contraceptive method was one of the main reasons why women with disability are sterilized in Brazil. And this we can see as a justification which is reminiscent to the negative eugenics spread during the 20th century,
which was directed not only towards people with disabilities, but also towards immigrants, poor people, and Black people. As we will see in another case, the race of the women is a factor to be considered, especially when dealing with sterilization as a hygienic measure held requested by the state itself as a protector of some sort of collective interest on hygienic health. As for the second justification, which is protection from sexual violence, this seems to me as the most counterintuitive and odd reason to give, because this justification arises from the premise, from the correct premise, in fact, that women with disability are generally more vulnerable to sexual violence than people without disabilities and men with disabilities, for example. However, there doesn't seem to be a correlation between sterilization as means for protection from sexual violence. And in fact, sterilization in those cases may be a form to deepen the vulnerability, since hidden abuses that come from to be known because they generate undesirable pregnancies will not come to light in any circumstance. So in fact, what parents seem to be seeking while using this justification is not protection of the sterilized women with disabilities, but in fact, prevention for further burdens for them to carry. This, however, comes disguised as a discourse related to protection of the cared for, making it easier for parents to think that they are acting as beneficent caregivers of their daughters. One specific case that has been highlighted recently in Brazil is the one of Janaína Quirino, a Black poor woman who was sterilized due to a request made by the public ministry in Brazil, who is in charge for legal defense of individual and collective rights. In the initial petition, in the initial claim of the judicial procedure, it was emphasized that the action was aimed to defend the individual rights of the defendant, which is a person of low income with severe chemical dependencies, a contumacious, and was also a contumacious user of alcohol and other narcotic substances. It was also highlighted that the defendant was already the mother of 5 children, all minor, which is why it was recommended by the Health and Social Assistance Services of the municipality that Janaína was submitted to a sterilization as a contraceptive method, even against her will. And this was stated in the initial claim. According to the pleading, Janaína is constantly found wandering the streets of the city with clear signs of alcohol and drug abuse, and that would be reason enough for her to be sterilized. Thus, for the public prosecutor's office, there was no other alternative but the sterilization being the only, and I quote here, effective means to safeguard her life, her physical integrity, and that of eventual offspring that could be born and be put at serious risk by the destructive behavior of the mother. The interesting thing is that although initially the pleading was accepted, there was a legal appeal to the regional court, which overruled the initial decision, but this has come to happen after the sterilization was held. Here, we are talking about someone who was not considered civilly incapable by law, but was nevertheless seen socially as disabled, that disability being more comprehensible through the lens of DISCREET, which is disability critical race studies. So one quote I would take from that case for us to keep in mind before going to the legal procedures about sterilization in Brazil is it comes from a bachelor thesis written by a Black woman with psychosocial disability who is Ana Carolina Barros, and she says regarding the participation of Janaína in the legal procedure that the progressive marginalization of Janaína's body is in the process a mere record. As I participated her examination board and read this statement, the specific sentence resonated with me for weeks and made me realize that the judicial procedure, which is established by family planning law to secure reproductive autonomy, is here just a mere legal seal to reproductive violence. A judicial procedure in these circumstances is indeed a mere legitimation record of marginalization. And this marginalization has been happening long before the sentence was held. Marginalization that in fact started with her race, her social class, her gender, and her psychosocial disability. So now approaching the legal situation, in Brazil, we have a family planning law, Law 9263 from 1996, that regulates family planning as a citizenship right that arises from Article 226 from Federal Constitution. And in family planning law, sterilization is one of the mechanisms available to control reproductive capacity that is allowed only when different conditions are fulfilled. When it comes to sterilization of people who hold full civil capacity, Article 10 of the law establishes that the person who requires for the procedure must be firstly over 25 years old or must have 2 living children. Secondly, there must be a minimum period of 60 days between the manifestation of the desire to be sterilized and the sterilization itself, which being this manifestation of the desire registered in a written and signed document after the person is duly informed of the surgical risks, collateral and possible effects, difficulties of reversion, and existence of reversible contraceptive options. Thirdly, in this 60 days period, there must be provided access to fertility service, including counseling by a multidisciplinary team aiming at discouraging early sterilization. On the other hand, when risk to life or health of the woman or the future child is identified, law makes the procedure conditional to the preparation of a written report signed by 2 doctors. So in case of absolutely incompetent people as stated by the law, there is only one condition, which is judicial authorization. According to law, regulations about judicial authorization procedures should have been placed by the executive government, and this should have happened just after the enactment of the law, but the law has now, it's now 25 years old and no regulation whatsoever was produced. But still, many judicial authorizations were indeed given. This article remains unchanged, even when the category of absolute incapacity was modified due to a reform in the Civil Code in 2016, operated by the Brazilian inclusion law. So although in Brazil, virtually all of the people with disabilities must not be seen, none of them must be seen as absolutely incompetent, hence making it impossible for them to be sterilized under this article provision. I have found that in a study that I carried in 2018, that in 2016 and 2017, 12 legal procedures for judicial sterilization of women with disability have been authorized. I highlight that this kind of research is not representative of the quantity, the total of the sterilization of women in Brazil, because most of the procedures are not scrutinized by the judiciary. For example, as we have seen in the study provided by Regis in 2013, amongst the 23 cases which she studied, only 3 were authorized judicially. So, however, I believe that this kind of analysis can reveal some important things regarding the alliance between law and psychiatry, especially when we perceive that all of these women were persons with cognitive, intellectual, psychosocial, and mental disabilities, and at least 5 of them have been victims of sexual violence. In these sexual violence cases, the protection against sexual abuse is highlighted as the main reason for the authorization. There are also 2 important things that I could conclude at the time of this research. One was that changing civil capacity laws was a strategy with very limited effects, because although people with disabilities were supposed to be recognized as holding equal legal capacity, even according to Article 12 of the Convention of Rights of People with Disabilities, these procedures were mostly not analyzed by courts And even when they were, judges still were deciding according to their own prejudices and stereotype perspectives about disabilities, regardless of modifications in law. Secondly, there is in Brazil an urgent need for more empirical studies to recover the experiences of women who have been sterilized and to explore how decisions about reproductive choice and capacity were made in the past and continue to be made to this day. So regarding family law and the rules imposed through sterilization, the feminist critique in Brazil has been structured from a strong emphasis on valuing personal autonomy. The concept of reproductive rights has been central to feminist campaigns in Brazil that have demanded the right of women to control their own bodies. This is related to the claim of safeguarding minimal state interference in the sphere of women's private choices. The focus has been here to defend that the woman's choice to undergo sterilization, even if she does not meet the requirements of Article 10, it's a necessary given that there is an autonomous decision. So there is a presumption that given that certain age and procedural criteria are met, the woman will have the autonomy to decide, regardless of the preexistence of children or marital consent. Nevertheless, for women with disabilities, there is a social presumption of incompetence, which hinders decision-making outside paternalistic schemes. As people with disabilities are deemed to be regarded as non-autonomous, the prevailing view in principalism bioethics is that paternalism towards them is just a form of weak paternalism. So in short, if it cannot be conceived that the women with disability to be sterilized are autonomous subjects, the measure to sterilize them is not conceptually paternalistic, since there is no self-determined will to be overridden. This stance is a consequence of, I believe, an intersection between mostly gender, race, and disability, given that there is a presumption of basic incompetence of people with these social markers to either consent to sexual acts, exercise maternity in correct manners, decide about the number of their offspring, and understand prevention and birth control policies. I believe, and now I am about to finish, I believe departing from what Martha Feynman calls the myth of autonomy should not be the appropriate path for us to follow, because the very idea of individualistic autonomy, of autonomy as independence, is the one behind the affirmation that people with disabilities are naturally incompetent or naturally lacking capacities, amongst them maternal capacities. In the context of these arguments, I believe that reproductive autonomy can only be used to address the issue of non-voluntarily sterilization of women with disability if we seek to unravel the concept of autonomy from traditional cognitivist biases, which equate it with the notion of independence. This mindset will have to look both at the supports required for the exercise of relational autonomy and that attitudinal barriers, amongst which are the negative stereotypes that dichotomize maternity and disability. Thus, disability feminism needs to think from a model of autonomy that adequately captures the notions of interdependence and ongoing support that is crucial to the realization of autonomy for people with intellectual disabilities. So for Laura Davis, that means also that it's necessary to understand autonomy as enabled relationally through a network of relationships that require support and advocacy rather than a status or a psychological attribute. I conclude by saying that non-voluntary sterilization of people with disabilities is why our definitions of reproductive violence must emphasize that reproductive autonomy does not equate with independence on decision-making over one's own body. In that sense, if we are to stick with the defense of autonomy as a basis for reproductive rights, we must relationally redefine autonomy here. So that was my presentation.
Wonderful. Let's thank our speaker. And I was wondering if the speakers mind if we do the Q&A at the very end and we do the next talk right away. Is that cool with people? All right, excellent. So next we have Lupe Davidson and David Monk presenting their paper entitled Environmental Justice and the Language of.
Oh, are you still there, Tamara? Okay, good. You just cut out like, okay, good. Let me go to my notes here, sorry. Well, thank you so much for sharing your time today. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, awesome. I really appreciate your paper. Was really wonderful, Luana. So thank you so much for that. And Tamara, thank you so much for moderating. My co-author, Dr. David Monk, is in Uganda, and he is 7 hours ahead of us right now, so it's quite late there. So I believe he's here in spirit, but for today, I'm going to be holding it down for both of us. I do want to say some things before I get into the presentation. So number one, this work is new for us. But the passion, like the passion for the work is not new, right? We're both very committed to environmental justice. We're also incredibly committed to just radical acts of solidarity rooted in reciprocity, love, respect, right? But nevertheless, this is really the first time that we've had an opportunity to think together and to think out loud on this topic of entitlement and environmental justice and ecofeminism. So it is very much a work in process. I am really looking forward to conversation, and I invite you all to think with us out loud and to help us workshop these thoughts so that we can shape this paper, right, and make it a bit more comprehensible even. I'm gonna do kind of what I'm gonna call a traditional presentation. I'm just gonna read my paper, and I'm gonna actually share my screen so that you all can read along with me. All right, so let me go ahead and do that, then I'll begin. Okay, can you enable screen share for me? It's okay?
Yeah, sorry, 1 second.
Okay, it's okay. Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks. That should work now.
Okay, awesome. Let's see. Okay. Everyone see okay? Good. All right. So environmental justice and the language of life. Introduction. Ecofeminism is an umbrella term for multiple approaches to environmental justice through a feminist lens. Ecofeminism likens the subjugation of women to the subjugation of nature, and it seeks to link the struggle of women's liberation with the struggle for environmental justice. This movement continues to expand and give rise to new research that broadens the framework, including queer approaches to the environment, rhetorical approaches to the environment, and access approaches to the environment, including those connected to disability and racial access to national parks. Yet across the spectrum of ecofeminism, one element seems consistently present but unacknowledged, and that is the language of entitlement. To reveal the role that this assumption plays within ecofeminism, we will begin with a discussion of Kate Mann's most recent work on the language of entitlement. Building on Mann's insight, we then set out to show that the notion of entitlement is operative implicitly and uncritically within the discourse of ecofeminism. This paper interrogates and complicates ecofeminism's reliance on the language of entitlement. We propose that the language of entitlement flattens ecofeminism's revolutionary potential insofar as it carries out an operation of othering and thereby harbors the potential to enact its own form of exploitation and dominance. Section 1 on misogyny and entitlement. Kate Mann examines how the language of entitlement functions to demarcate the different boundaries of agency for men and women respectively. The language of entitlement, as Mann shows, is used to justify the exclusion and oppression of women, even going so far as to justify acts of violence against women. One of the strengths of Kate Mann's book, Down Girl, is that it resists conflating patriarchy with sexism, chauvinism, and/or misogyny. It is not that these notions are unrelated. On the contrary, Mann shows that they are codependent. Mann's argument is that patriarchy is a system and that the violences of sexism, male chauvinism, and misogyny play different but invaluable roles within the maintenance and enforcement of the patriarchal system. In this way, misogyny is neither something that stands apart from patriarchy, nor is it patriarchy by another name. According to Mann, the best way to conceptualize misogyny is as patriarchy's brutal enforcer. Patriarchy demarcates the boundaries of acceptable gender behavior. When those boundaries are violated, misogyny uses force, language, psychological, or physical to hold the line. In this way, Mann offers feminists a productive way to understand patriarchy, as well as the brute force patriarchy exerts on our bodies. Mann's new book, entitled, adopts a similar approach in the sense that she takes a concept, in this case, entitlement, and shows how entitlement, can be instrumentalized and weaponized. Like misogyny, entitlement is utilized, to quote here, to produce unjust, perverse, and sometimes bizarre outcomes, end quote, that characterizes the system of violence. Mann describes her project in the following terms, quote, "This book shows that an illegitimate, emphasis added, sense of male entitlement gives rise to a wide range of misogynistic behavior. When a woman fails to give a man what he is supposedly owed, she will often face punishment and reprisal, whether from him, his sympathetic supporters, or the misogynistic social structures in which she is embedded," end quote. Mann frames the relationship between misogynistic males and put upon females in transactional terms, where there is a failure on the part of the female/worker to provide some good or service to which the male/customer is due. In a transactional misogynistic society, punishment for this failure are meted out along a continuum of escalating violence, including verbal assault, loss of livelihood, rape and other forms of sexual violence, acid thrown in the eyes, strangulation, death. Consider the most recent example of the woman raped on the train in Philadelphia. That was like 2 weeks ago. This poor woman spent 40 minutes pushing her assailant away while onlookers watched as the man groped and violated her on the train, but they failed to intervene. He raped her for 8 minutes and no one stopped it. The media analysis of this situation is centered on intervention and bystander empowerment, but nothing is said about the broader assumption of male entitlement to women's bodies and how this presumption may have influenced the bystander's lack of response to a woman in distress. When has female distress ever trumped male entitlement? This, for me, is a very heavy question. Mann provides many examples of toxic forms of male entitlement to women's bodies, to sex from women, to admiration, to nurturing, etc. And she chronicles the consequences that follow when male entitlement to these goods and services are not met. Nevertheless, it would be inaccurate, we think, to conclude that Mann sees all forms of entitlement as negative, harmful, or dangerous. For Mann, entitlement is neither inherently good or evil. Instead, it is culturally and historically constructed. Entitlement, too, is shaped by one's approach to oneself and how one sees oneself as situated and embodied, and others, how you see others as situated and embodied. Accordingly, in the hands of the egoist who is birthed, nurtured, and enabled by patriarchy, entitlement is about what others owe to oneself, and male entitlement thereby becomes a deadly weapon utilized against women. But in the hand of others, quote here, learning what one is entitled to is, or at least should be, inextricably connected with learning what one owes to others, end quote. On this latter point, Mann provides her infant daughter, who is really the audience for this last chapter of her book, with a list of things she is entitled to simply in virtue of being. So she's entitled to things like feeling pain and asking for help. She's entitled to bodily autonomy and freedom, gender and sexuality freedom, bodily expression through various activities. She's entitled to agency and voice. She's entitled to be complete. But for Mon, this positive sense of entitlement differs from male entitlement because it is always connected to, quote here, moral obligations, the obligation of all of us share, regardless of our gender, to make this world one in which structural injustices are actively being rectified, end quote. Mon extols all of us to, quote here, fight for a world in which the bodies of girls and women are not routinely controlled, sexualized, harassed, assaulted, and injured, or even destroyed, end quote. In such a world, we would all be entitled to justice and would have mutual obligations to promote justice. Mon's book is both honest and good. We appreciate how she resists defining entitlement and instead shows us examples of what entitlement can be and do when it is set on a particular trajectory. Without offering any specific definitions of entitlement, Mon opens up a space for us to engage with entitlement from the point of our own embodiment, which is her approach, and as a deep symbol or a word of power that shapes our engagement with ourselves, with others, and with the earth. Section 2 on the intrusion of entitlement. That said, we want to examine the theme of entitlement as it plays out in the context of ecofeminist thought. Rosemary Tong observes that, quote here, all ecofeminists agree with Rosemary Radford Ruther that women's and nature's liberation are a joint project. That women's and nature's liberation are a joint project. Ruther's words are worth quoting in full. Okay. Women must see that there can be no liberation for them and no solution to the ecological aims within society, whose fundamental model of relationships continue to be one of domination. They must unite the demand of the women's movement with those of the ecological movement to envision a radical reshaping of the basic socioeconomic relations and the underlying values of this modern industrial society, end quote. I'm gonna read that again because this is the quote that has been vexing me, okay? Again, women must see that there can be no liberation for them and no solution to the ecological aims within society, whose fundamental model of relationship continues to be one of domination. They must unite the demand for women's movement with those of the ecological movement to envision a radical reshaping of the basic socioeconomic relations and the underlying values of this modern industrial society, end quote. Like Ruther, Karen Warren also sees the political potential in uniting both struggles. Warren argues that, quote here, understanding the nature of these connections is necessary to any adequate understanding of the oppression of women and the oppression of nature, end quote. Thus, she continues, feminist theory and practice must include an ecological perspective, and solutions to ecological problems must include a feminist perspective. In principle, we also see in value. We see value in the aim to link women's and nature's liberation as a joint project. The linkage between these two struggles would have the desired effect of A, uniting both struggles under one liberatory project, and B, moving toward what we would call a deep collaboration between environmental and women's liberation activists. But yet, we want to highlight some of the possible ways in which this linkage might be problematic. Black feminist scholars have repeatedly warned about the potentially negative effects of the linkage of struggles. When struggles become linked, there is a threat that one struggle will be subsumed or flattened by another's cause. In the case of Black women, the danger is always that historical power differentials between our struggles will lead our own struggle to become adjunct to another's. This is clearly evident in the respective histories of the Black liberation movement and the women's liberation movement. In both cases, Black women's freedom was tethered to, determined, and flattened by the struggle of Black women and by Black men and white women. Black men in the fight for racial equality and white women in the fight for gender equality respectively claimed an entitlement to speak on behalf of Black women. As a result, the distinctive concerns of Black women were pushed aside by But shouldn't Black women be able to speak from our own positionality? Shouldn't Black women's voices be the primary voices articulating our own freedom? We are concerned that ecofeminists like Brother Warren and many others may replicate some of the very same mistakes made by white feminists in the women's liberation movement. In seeking collaboration with Black feminists, they feel entitled or felt entitled to speak for Black women on the basis of what we see as an imagined affinity. Regardless of whether this is intentional or unintentional, the concern here is about an overly homogenous conception of feminism that ignores the role of privilege and power differentials within the women's liberation movement. In light of this concern, we are called to wonder about the actual distortions that might occur in the process of linking these two struggles, if it ignores the differentials that exist within the feminist movement itself. Second, we think we must interrogate the role of entitlement here and ask whose voice is privileged to speak on behalf of a shared struggle. Third, this question of entitlement carries over into environmental justice as well, and leads us to ask whose voice is privileged to speak on behalf of nature. How might those who advocate for collaboration and fighting against domination be engaged in a projection of their own particular identities and their own particular conceptions of the feminine onto nature? Allow us for a moment to reflect on this last question. Psychological projection may arise from a deep desire to feel with an other by externalizing an internal quality or making the faraway close and relatable. According to Anne Archambault, quote here, some ecofeminists have argued that women are in a better position than men to relate with nature, that they are in fact closer to nature and hence can derive some unique insight from this bond, end quote. Vis-a-vis what Archambault refers to as a body-based argument or the oppression argument. Ecofeminists, quote, derive an ethics based on historically undervalued feminine values of care, love, friendship, trust, and appropriate reciprocity that is meant to overcome all forms of domination. But where did this entitlement come from? Where did it come from? And what are its consequences? I'm gonna end there. For practical reasons in that there are no more words on the page. And also because I really, I'm really interested in having a conversation, about this issue, right? More deeply. So thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. I'm gonna push my seat down here a bit. Cool.
Thank you so much, Lupe, for an excellent presentation. If you have a question for Lupe or Luana, please either use the raise hand function or type something in the chat so that I know to call on you. And yeah, we can move on to Q&A now. So I guess I could start us off. I have a question for Luana. Luana, I loved your presentation. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. A question I had was whether you think that, so part of your argument was that, people have misjudged the autonomy of Brazilian women with disabilities. And because of that, this has sort of served as a kind of horrible justification to inflict reproductive violence on them in the form of sterilization. I wondered though if we might say that forced sterilization is wrong regardless of what we say about the autonomy of any individual. And I was wondering if you could say a little more about why you think autonomy is the crucial link there rather than just forced sterilization in general being the thing that we need to be arguing against.
So are you listening to me? Because I'm in the computer now. So this is the point, right? All of our definitions, are you listening?
Your audio is very bad.
Okay, so probably I'll have to go again in the cell phone, sorry. Your question is wonderful, and this is the reason why I'll be again joining the conversation from another Please let me in.
Yeah, no problem. Take.
So there you are. Is everything okay?
There's a pretty crazy echo.
Okay,
Maybe if you logged
now
out,
it's
out
okay.
of the computer and you stayed on.
Okay, so the main point is that our definitions of reproductive violence stand upon reproductive autonomy. And we have this discussion in feminist bioethics, which is, should we safeguard the perils of autonomy that indeed we got through our affirmation of reproductive rights, or should we dismiss autonomy altogether to the critique of interdependence? And on the other side, we also have, amongst the feminists who analyzed autonomy, the proceduralist ones. So the ones who would say, yeah, this decision might be autonomous or not if some procedures are followed. And the substantive feminists, which believe that there is no autonomy defined outside value schemes, right? Cultural schemes. So every decision made by a woman in a paternalistic society is somehow non-autonomous in some way. My point here is to say, if we are to stick with autonomy, then it is urgent that we redefine it from a relational point of view. And this relational autonomy, which is tributary to the notion of relational autonomy of Martha Feynman. But there is another path that we could take, actually. This path might be more deconstructive than the path of sticking to autonomy. The other path would be to deconstruct autonomy itself, the very idea of autonomy, the very notion that, for example, if something is forced, in any way, it should be wrong. We must not analyze if that person is or not autonomous. For bioethics, there is also principalism bioethics. There is also a problem there that non-autonomous persons, decisions regarding them are not paternalistic, at least in a strict sense. They are a form of weak paternalism, which to Bouchamp is not paternalism itself. So all of these actions are decided in the non-maleficence principle. So these actions, they must only be, they must only follow the do no harm command. And we have many problems with following the do no harm command if we are either going to follow best interests standard, if we're either going to follow a quality of life standards. And these standards, they rarely take into account the will of the person. It's him or herself, or themselves. We have many options to interpret this problem. And I think, personally, I don't know yet how to stand myself, my Luana point of view in this discussion, but I have been facing some critics from feminists when I try to pose the whole ethics of care critique of deconstruction autonomy. As I'm a feminist myself, I have to try to come to a middle ground. And that middle ground, I believe, could be relational autonomy. So that's my stance now for this. Maybe for some moments, maybe I will follow another path. But this has been for me the most how do I say, conventional option to follow in this maze of different perspectives.
Yeah, thanks so much. That's super helpful. So there's a question in the chat from Danielle. I'll just read it out just to make sure everyone has access to it. So Danielle says, these presentations were both wonderful. I'd like to hear from each of you what are effective platforms to safeguard marginalized women's voices so that their needs can be heard and those with power can use that power to put vulnerable women's needs first and to act in ways prompted by those who are marginalized. And this is a question for both speakers.
Can you read it one more time?
Yeah, sure. So Danielle would like to hear from each of you, what are some effective platforms to safeguard marginalized women's voices so that their needs can be heard and those with power can use that power to put vulnerable women's needs first and act in ways prompted by those who are marginalized?
May I, Luana, just?
For sure.
I'm trying to think about like when you say like effective platforms, right? And so I'm trying to like think through like, maybe Danielle, you can kind of say a little bit more like platforms. What do you mean by platforms?
So I'm just thinking, what are the ways in which marginalized voices can best be heard, best be centered? Because it strikes me it's usually not traditional academia. It's not in the mainstream media. So yeah, I'm not expressing this question well, but how do we hear those voices and so that we can really respond to them and be advocates?
I love this question. I love this question because this was the question or one of the questions that I was trying to answer in relation to like nature, right? Like, so what does it mean to hear nature's voice, right? When nature doesn't speak with a human voice, right? Or with a voice that is legible, right? So it's a question about legibility. That was the question I was
Yes, that is well said. Thank you.
And so I think for me, and so this is really helpful. I think like this acknowledgement, there has to be some sort of acknowledgement and understanding that we all don't communicate, number one, in similar ways or in ways that are legible to one another, right? And that are in the forms that we communicate in, even if they're not legible to the other, they're still valid and valuable, right? And so like recognizing the different ways in which communication happens, be it the tree, the air, the water, the marginalized woman of color, right? That we just speak differently, right? And so there's a difference in communication. And for me, the tricky part is in the valuing, right? The valuing the difference in communication. So Danielle, that's like, I think that that's one of the things I'm really trying to work through in this paper, right? Like we just the inability to hear the other. And so I'm just going to speak for myself as like my own embodied self. Like what would help me is I think that if those in power would not force me to speak and would hear me when I am speaking, right? And so like to kind of value the silence, right? But also value the ways in which I feel comfortable in interacting in particular spaces, right? I don't know if this is helpful, but it's really one of the things that I've struggled with and I am continuing to struggle with, right? Issues around legibility and voice and communication. I'm struggling.
Lupe, I think that's really, really helpful because hearing the process and just the idea to allow silence when silence is what's at play. So thank you. I appreciate that.
All that you have, right? Sometimes, yeah.
Mhm.
So I'd like also to jump in to the question for a moment. As I work with mostly non-auralized autistics, there is a problem as these people are regarded as non-communicable, right? They are regarded as having no communication. And this is actually the first prejudice that we have to tackle while talking about people with deemed severe autism, that actually there is communication, but there is something what you would call non-standard communication. So to think about a being that is not communicable, it's to think about us not being able to perceive that communication, and not actually the individual, him, her, itself, not being able to communicate. And this is a stance that would have to go back to sort of a phenomenological approach, but also to consider the consequences of epistemic injustice, because at some point in time, other individuals were also deemed not to be able to communicate, and now have perfectly recognizable voices. So when we are talking, for example, this kind of question always reminds me of Spivak, which is who would say that epistemic violence is actually structural violence to all of the other forms of racial, gender-fied, and disability-based violence. So ways to do so, I think, regarding disability is to recognize support as valuable, is to recognize the value of support, and recognize that we all need support to be understood, being someone with or without disabilities. I need this support that I have right now. I need my cell phone. As you saw some moments ago, I was not able to communicate because of my cybernetic problems. And when I don't have my support, when I don't have this support, I cannot be understood. So to recognize these bridges that caregivers, not only caregivers, but non-standard practices of communication can provide, as recognizing these people and these instruments as valuable, might be, and also legally valuable, I think, might be a path to platform the subaltern to have to tackle their Spivak's lexicon, to platform the subaltern's voice, to make it possible for the subaltern to speak.
Thank you, Luana. That was really helpful.
It's really interesting how ineligible, when we deem someone illegible, that how that invites a speaking for that person, right? So this is what they want. This is what they need, right? This is what they need. And how do we disrupt that, right? I mean, it's just, even for children, you see it, they can't speak, so I will speak for them, right? And what entitles, and then for me, that gets me to the questions of entitlement. What entitles you to speak for the other? So.
Great. Our next question is from Miguel.
Hi, thanks. Very interesting presentations and important problems. I have a question for Lupe Davidson. And in this author, you were talking about what does she say about why we are all entitled to justice, if she says something about it. And for example, women that do not support women's liberation or do not help other women, have an entitlement to justice, or when or where does this entitlement ends? Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. One thing I like about Mon, and I think probably one of the things I find a little bit frustrating about her, is that sometimes she can be very non-committal, right? And so I'm thinking about like how she herself would answer that question. I think that she would say that by virtue of just being, like we are all just entitled to justice because we breathe and we are and we exist, right? And so, and that's in the last chapter of her book on entitlement when she's talking to her daughter. She's saying just because you are you, you're entitled to all those things. And so I don't think that she would, so even if you act in a way that is contrary, right? And so I'm thinking about like women who resist or stand in the way of the liberation of other women, right? Their actions or the actions that we might, not agree with don't take away their entitlement to justice, right? And they don't lose that right? Even if they inhibit on someone else's right. So I don't know if that's helpful, Miguel.
Yeah.
Do you disagree with that?
Well, sometimes maybe we must have an end to this entitlement, because how would you ask justice for yourself if you don't help the others, or you don't do the correct behavior in normal life? So I think we must have an stop to this entitlement for justice. I don't know where, but we must have.
So that for me is really interesting, because it links to that situation that I mentioned about the woman that was raped on the train in front of all those bystanders, right?
Yes,
so there's this kind of argument of should they
Yes.
be charged, right? Should they be charged with some sort of
Maybe.
crime because they did not intervene, right? Some sort of Good Samaritan laws that were always, I don't know if anyone present can talk more about that issue of Good Samaritan laws, but if you don't intervene when you see someone being injured, should you be held liable? Jen, I see your hand up. Do you have?
I had a slightly separate question. I can say that Good Samaritan laws differ by state, right? So in the United States, which is the only country I can speak to, right? But in the United States, in some states, there's a legal obligation of easy rescue, right? So you're not obliged to like physically intervene, but in some states in the United States, you are obliged to like call the police or tell somebody to call the police, right? You can be held liable for doing nothing. And so I think, yeah, it's from the legal perspective. That's as much as I know.
No, I hear you. Yeah.
But I did have
big
issue. Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, these cases come up so often, where people just fail to intervene, right? Yep. Okay.
Yeah, bad. Can I ask a separate question though? Is that okay? Okay, cool. I wanted to, Lupi, I think this question is more for you, just because I came in and only heard your presentation. I'm sorry, Luana. I was in Jose's presentation. I'd like to. I want to think a little bit more about this in an academic context, right? Since I think most of us work in academic context, right? And so I really like the sort of the important, right, sort of points you raised, right, where we have to make sure, right, that we're not re-engaging in the same mistakes, right, of the past. But I think that becomes a really interesting question when you do put it into an academic context, right, where like part of what I do as a teacher, right, is I feel like I have to teach the past so that the students can then get a grip on like what's going on now. And so I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to like the dangers of having to teach these kinds of, like, especially these past theoretic works, right, that are persuasive, right? Like, even though they're wrong, they're persuasive. And so students are then right? I mean, I see this in my students at least, right? Like, they're tempted to go ahead and reify that. And you're like, no, I taught it to you, but I didn't want you to accept it. Like, right. And so I was just wondering if you could speak about that a little more in an academic context.
This is tough for me too, right? Because I'm thinking, like, when I first, I remember, like, when I first taught ecofeminism, and I'm hearing it, and it makes sense to me, but I'm also aware of the problematics, and it makes sense to me because, like, I want to stand in solidarity, right? But I think that I always have to challenge myself and remind myself not to present these theories of the past in an uncritical way, right? So, like, we always have to be critical. We always have to be critical, even of our heroes, right? And so, if I can give you like a really quick example, I'm thinking about Judith Butler, and with Judith Butler and her writing that letter in support of that one scholar. But like, in teaching Butler and standing in solidarity with Butler and many of the things that she's argued for, but I remember, like, when that happened, I couldn't teach Butler without talking about this other stuff, right? And so I think that we just always have to be critical, and we always have to be critical and complicate, right? So that our students can learn to be critical and complicate as well, and not just take the theories that we teach them on face value and reproduce the same violences, right? Because that's what ends up happening, right? They just end up reproducing the same violences if we're not critical. Yep.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. But then I wonder, I have lovely students. I adore my students, right? But then, like, some of them become, and I think this is maybe the worry, right? Like, I worked so hard to get their critical lens up and running, and now they're, I have one of my students who's just like, well, I'm out, right? And I'm like, no, like, don't be out. And she's like, but I'm over it. It all sucks. And I'm like, but no, right? And so I worry about that too, right? Because there's not much, she's not wrong. Right, as you say, like, right, we have to develop that critical lens, but that critical lens can, like, eat us in a certain way. Does that make sense? I don't know. I'm making sense.
No, it does make sense. I'm hoping that others can jump in and help me here, right? As well. Does anyone have any thoughts around this? Because in a way, it's like, I don't want to say tearing down your idols, right? Tearing down those things that you might hold dear, but I'm also about that life too, right? I'm also about, like, tearing down those idols, and I think it's okay, right? But it also, like, shows our students that people and things and places, that these are complex. They are not flat, and we're not gonna fucking flatten them, right? We're not gonna fucking flatten them. We're gonna deal with them as they are.
Yeah, no, and I think that's right, and I think I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't mean this to be just a conversation between you and me. So if anybody else has thoughts, because I genuinely find myself stuck here, right? Because I'm perfectly happy to do it every day, right? Because this is, like, my life as an academic, right? Like this is what I do, and I'm happy to live in that space of critical thought and contradiction and complexity, right? But I feel bad for my student who's like, I tried to go out to a bar the other night and just couldn't, because I couldn't, like, deal with the way people were acting, because I just wanted to tell them, like, all of these things. I'm like, well, don't do that at a bar, because somebody will hit you. Like, don't do that. But, like, so I don't know if anybody has any thoughts.
Yeah, I have the same issue. I teach a lot of historical works in philosophy, like I do a lot of Plato and Aristotle. And obviously they were sexist, and obviously they were racist in many ways. And I want to talk with my students about that, but at the same time, I don't want them to, like, write these people off completely. And I even confront this in courses that are not historical that I teach. Like in my philosophy and feminist theory course, we read Marilyn Fry and Sandra Bartke, and my students, some of them, not all of them, immediately write them off simply on the basis that, well, they're white women, and I don't trust them, they're white women feminists. And so one thing that I try to do is like, yes, I want them to be critical, but I want them to be critical in a sophisticated way. And so I would like to know ways to like teach students to take that critical lens and do it in a way that's more constructive than simply like, this person has this identity and that's not the identity that I want to listen to. So I'm going to argue that they're not a good philosopher, which is like really too bad. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like this is such a big issue and we've already run up to the end of our session. But I mean, we can stop there.
Well, and Luana, I was just going to say, Luana, I think it speaks back to your point, right, about deconstructive, right, deconstructing autonomy, right, and that deconstructive feminism, right, which you were saying is so powerful, but also we have to be really careful with it, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yes. Derrida actually has this concept of how do I say that in English? I think it's interactivity, which is to use a concept in different ways, but in order to adapt it to our needs or to other mentalities. And deconstruction itself has been interactively changed, right? I was having this discussion with a student of mine who said that why do we have to study Freud, or why do we have to study Heidegger, especially when we have Lélia Gonzalez, which Lélia Gonzalez is a person from, probably most of you don't know, but she is a Black feminist philosopher from the 70s in Brazil. And I told him, well, because Lélia Gonzalez herself read and used Freud and Heidegger, so she could make her critique. So she could make her own critique about this subject. So wouldn't you want to have the same experience as Lélia Gonzalez had, but at this present time, at this present days, wouldn't you want to be able to analyze what was written by these authors with the same critique mindset that Lélia Gonzalez had while doing her work? So this is always what I say, like most of our works are made between the lines and from within the lines, deconstructing them. So these are authors that we have to read but never worship. These are people that we have to know but never rely upon, and this is how we move forward, right?
Yeah, that's really wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for an excellent discussion. We have to end here. I hope to see you later. Thank you so much.